Hey there and welcome to the program. It's great to be back. Joining me on the panel tonight, CEO of Autism Awareness Australia, Nicole Rogerson. Public health strategist, Bill Bowtell. In Brisbane tonight, one of the crowd favourites from Love on the Spectrum. We're delighted to welcome Jayden Evans. Also from Canberra, Labor's Andrew Leigh. And with us, epidemiologist Marylouise McLaws. And due to join us shortly is Liberal Senator Hollie Hughes, who, as it turns out, has gone into isolation tonight herself and is awaiting COVID test results. So she'll join us during the program when she can. Please make all of them feel welcome.
There have been more cases or similar amount of cases in Sydney than there was in the Northern Beaches in December when they went into lockdown. So why hasn't Sydney gone into lockdown?
Marylouise McLaws, I know you were going to be in the studio with us tonight. You've decided not to explain why. It's to do with this question, isn't it?
It is. Given that I've been saying since last week that we should have gone into a short, sharp lockdown to keep everybody from moving around, particularly those that don't know they're infected, I decided that I need to practice what I preach as an outbreak manager.
Has New South Wales got it wrong?
I think New South Wales is loath to use lockdowns. Mostly every other state does. Outbreak managers who've had practical experience understand the adage of go in early, go in hard with very inadequate or imperfect data. And then when there isn't any outbreak, they get criticised, but often they do the right thing. So I think that this time they've had a very slow increase in numbers and then a very high peak, which is quite unusual for this variant of concern. But I still think that they should have gone into a sharp lockdown to stop people from particularly wandering over the weekend.
To Noah's question, though, when the Northern Beaches went into lockdown, there was 38 cases, I think, linked to that cluster. There's 36 cases linked to the Bondi cluster, 49 locally acquired infections so far in this latest Sydney outbreak. Can you help us understand why a different decision is being taken here?
Well, I think that with the Northern Beach outbreak, and they had 41 in total, and it took them over a month to get to zeros. I think that they went into lockdown fast because of the large numbers at the beginning, and so that they were very concerned it would be out of control, and quite rightly, they went into lockdown. It was sensible. And they were identified as being very sensible. With this one, because it went slowly and because they probably missed the boat in stopping people from wandering on the weekends, going to New Zealand, going to Melbourne, going to a party, etc. They probably feel they don't want to now, or they feel they've got it under control. But I'm concerned that that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah. Do you really think they have it under control in New South Wales?
Well, no. I mean, we've had several cases that are potentially causing more harm down in Melbourne. We have the hairdresser that has been a mystery link, as they call it. Then we've had the woman that went to New Zealand. So we're going to see more cases. They may not be enormous in number, but that's beside the point. This is a variant of concern that has a reputation for causing more hospitalisation and, of course, more children because of the large numbers of people they can infect.
All right, let's take our next question. It comes from Eric Coleman.
Just leading on from the last question, I think it sort of leads on quite well. Is the current handling of the New South Wales COVID cluster by testing and contact tracing, coupled with proportionate measures such as mask wearing, something that the other states can learn from rather than plunging entire cities into lockdown at the first sign of a positive COVID community case, as we've seen in Brisbane and Perth?
Bill Bowtell.
Well, we're here now, 18 months into the pandemic, and we are repeating, we're back to where we were, it seems, February, March last year. And by now, 18 months into this, what we should be thinking about is how we could prudently open up our borders internally and internationally, and we're not. And the reason we're not is because there's been a very serious failure of quarantine arrangements, particularly in this case at Sydney Airport, and a very poor vaccination rate. So we don't have the options that we would have if in Australia today 57% of people had double vaccinations. Only about 5% have. So we brought this on ourselves by the decisions that have been taken that have not really kept up with the emergence of the COVID Delta variant, which is much more infectious. This was not the case with the Northern Beaches episode in Sydney or the Crossroads. It is much more infectious. And the Premier's right to say this is a very scary moment. But you can't have it both ways. You can't say it's a scary moment and we must do all of the things that we must do, testing and so on, and then think, well, it's business as usual. We can be comfortable and this word proportionate in our response. We only have one weapon in our armoury, unfortunately, now that works, and that's, as Marylouise said, a short, sharp lockdown.
Marylouise, then, if the argument is that what New South Wales has done in the past has worked, does it still work with the Delta strain?
Well, that's a very big experiment and not one that I'd be willing to play with people's lives. Correct. And, Bill has mentioned that this is highly infectious. Let me remind you that the Alpha strain was 33% more infectious than the wild strain, than the Wuhan. This one is double that. So in effect, it's about 90% more infectious than the Wuhan strain. And of course, we're seeing more people going to hospital. So it's an experiment that I don't think I would be willing to play with. And yes, Bill is quite right. The quarantine system is letting us down. We've had 21,000 cases since we developed this mandatory quarantine system because of the 27 breaches that we've had. We need to shore that up and we need to roll out the vaccine as soon as possible, but not to the Pfizer, but not to those that are anyone under 60 to 40, but to the group that are going to be more at risk of acquiring it and spreading it, and that's the 20 to 39-year-olds. They have to be our priority.
And Marylouise, the Prime Minister today dismissed that view and said that the design of this rollout is based on the medical advice. You're now at odds with the Prime Minister on this.
Well, I am. So last year, WHO provided me with the COVAX facility framework, and I went back to them and said, this is a very compassionate framework. They said, absolutely, because you're only going to get 3%, then 17%, so it has to be for frontline workers and the vulnerable. Quite right. However, that was for circulating virus, a high level of circulating virus. And I went back to them and said, but we are different. And they said, well, as a member country, you can do whatever you like. And so epidemiologists would then say, you go where you get most juice for your squeeze. And that is the 40% of cases in the 20 to 39-year-old. They are the biggest group. The next group, of course, is the 40 to 60, and that's only 24%. Now, sure, they don't have the same risk of death as those 70 and over. But if the young ones don't get it, they can't spread it. So we really need to protect the young right now.
Jayden, I want to bring you in here. You are in Queensland right now. You're joining us from Brisbane tonight because of these COVID border restrictions. You live in a state where there has been some short, sharp lockdowns and it seems a greater eagerness to lock borders down. Does it make sense to you why New South Wales isn't doing that right now, and Sydney particularly?
No, but I think that is a consequence of my own unawareness of the situation down there, in contrast to perhaps my state of being more informed about the situation here in Queensland. In Gympie more specifically, we have been very distant, I suppose, from the physical consequences of the status of lockdowns that have occurred. There's only really been, there was the start of the pandemic with the national lockdown, and then later there was a 2-week lockdown, not quite a lockdown in Gympie, but a 2-week period where we were mandated to wear masks. So that is all the contact we truthfully have had with the coronavirus. So we are quite distant from it. So having been in that environment, I possess no awareness of the situation that is occurring in New South Wales.
Nicole, you're in Sydney. Does it make sense to you?
Well, listen, you know what? I'm not going to be like everybody else on Twitter who's not an epidemiologist who gives their opinion on COVID, because we've got two incredible brains here who can do that. I would just say that some of the things to factor in, of course, we all have to behave and be grown-ups and get our vaccinations as soon as we possibly can. All of those things that we need to do exactly what the advice is telling us. But it's worthwhile just keeping in mind that when we talk about the vaccine rollout, yes, it has been poor across the board, but it's almost been non-existent for those with a disability. So that's a really shameful situation that we're in at the moment. People with a disability were recognised to be in phase 1B, and the vast majority of those, particularly those living in group housing, have not been vaccinated. So we're letting a lot of people down here.
As a person on the spectrum, I feel my autism is constantly measured against autistic characters in popular culture, like Sheldon Cooper from The Big Bang Theory and the lead doctor in The Good Doctor, both of which are not starring autistic actors or written by autistic people. My question to the panel is, how important is actually autistic voices in telling autistic stories plays a role in authentic autism representation?
Jayden.
All right, so this is curious. It is very, very important, because I think characters such as Sheldon Cooper and the character from The Good Doctor, I have not watched The Good Doctor, so I do not know the name of the character, but they, in many ways, they embody different archetypes of what has been presumed of autism, and that in itself can be entertaining in the instance of Sheldon Cooper, and in the instance of the character from The Good Doctor, I believe he is portrayed as a savant, which I suppose there's also some veracity in that as well. But the individuals I work with, they're not quite savants. They're not Sheldon Cooper, who is a physicist, nor a doctor who has all this access to resources and energy and I suppose the brilliance that being a doctor incurs as well. The people I work with are quite disadvantaged in their situations. They may not be aware of their diagnosis. They may not have access to the same resources as myself, and perhaps more, I suppose, I would say individuals who are privileged to have perhaps both a mother and a father who are willing to support them in that growth, who are willing to make them aware of that diagnosis and to accumulate the supports that are necessary. That's not always so with the people I work with. They, especially in Gympie, where I think in general there is, I suppose, an issue perhaps in the economic well-being of certain demographics in the community.
And probably opportunities, Jayden, too. I'd say, you know, it's a really good question, and if there were more opportunities for young people, or any age person on the autism spectrum, to be able to play a role in more mainstream shows, of course that would be incredibly welcome. It's a tricky one, right, though, because actors act, right? I was fairly sure that Matt Damon wasn't an astronaut in that film. So, like, you know, it's fair that you're allowed to come on and be something else. But I think...
But to that point, though, the nation's fallen in love with Jayden and a whole cast of characters from Love on the Spectrum. I want to ask him about that, but I also want to ask you, because you were approached about it in the beginning and you hated the idea. Why?
Jayden, just block your ears for a minute, OK? Yeah, so the producers of Love on the Spectrum came to me to ask me what the opinion was to make the show, and the genius level that I have in my television skills, I told them it was the worst idea. I might have even slightly threatened them, actually. I said it was just terrible and they weren't to do it. But to be fair...
You thought it was going to be like The Bachelor?
Well, your reality romantic shows aren't necessarily the classiest of shows. So I was the most wrong person on that, and Jayden and all of his colleagues that have been on the show over 2 seasons have done an excellent job, and Australia absolutely fell in love with them, and I know nothing.
Jayden, what has the reaction been for you? What's the experience been like, having people from all walks of life know you, know your story, and feel inclined to reach out to you and try and know you more?
Well, humbling a little bit. I've always approached with responses that I've tried to ensure were as modest as possible. It mostly has been through social media thus far. In Gympie, there has only been one person who has noticed me. I have grown a beard since my appearance in the documentary series, so I think that has impaired the ability of strangers to recognise me. But otherwise, in the streets, I have not ostensibly been recognised. On social media, there has been some engagement with people who were quite fond of the role of representation that I assumed in the series, and also, I suppose, my open exploration as well of certain aspects of my identity. So people were very fond to have been able to witness that.
Jayden, you mentioned earlier that the love life experienced a lot of interest from people on social media.
Yes, and it has been a little flirtatious, but I have been able to cope well with that. It simply is to respond with as much sincerity as I can to that, and sometimes play around with it a little as well. It seems to be a bit fun to play around with it.
Okay, don't break too many hearts. Dwayne Fernandez is in the audience. I know you're a fan of the show. What did you connect with so much?
Oh, I absolutely love the show. I've been watching it for the last 2 seasons. I've been following the journey of Michael and the entire crew. But Jayden, for you specifically, I did want to know, how do you find being part of the show and sharing so much of yourself?
How have I found that? Yeah. Liberating, in a sense, because it was discussed in the series, in the interviews that were done with me, that my diagnosis was not something I was always willing to acknowledge, and the repercussions of that, socially and emotionally, were not very ideal. So I put myself to the effort of studying it a little more, because I've always been adverse to labels. I think many people on the spectrum are, and that is why, or their parents as well, and that is why they may be adverse to the recognition of that diagnosis. For myself, diagnosis is the Greek word that means to know the thing by which one can know through, or no, I have put that very wrongly because it is tricky to put Greek terms into English terms, but a diagnosis, through a diagnosis, you can see something, you can know something, you can understand something. So for me, it was a point of reference where I can read about the patternicity of my mind, because even though I firmly believe that my mind and brain is very individualistic, I also know that it is a human brain as well, and therefore abides by the same patterns and neurological habits that everyone else abides by. So that has allowed me to find some identity with it, but also awareness that the responsibility of having that identity is to know that it's not quite by this dichotomy where I am a neurodiverse person and everyone is a neurotypical person, because that can be a bit precarious, where you begin to perceive yourself as different, or as a different tribe or group from everyone else, and that was precarious for me. So that was the responsibility I took on for myself, to be aware of that possibility, and to be as firm as I can in also associating myself with everyone else as much as possible, whilst acknowledging this part of my idiosyncrasy. So that the series has offered me a lot in my perception of that.
Hollie Hughes, I can see you smiling away at Jayden's response.
Oh, it's just lovely. I mean, I adore the program. I think everyone's just, it's so beautiful for people that don't have first-hand experience with autism to get to see the personalities of, and I think Nicole would agree with me here. We tend to use the phrase "our kids." Because we do see ourselves as part of a community. And Jayden, Michael, all of the boys and girls just do a beautiful job, throughout the series. But the beautiful thing, I think, about not only Love on the Spectrum, but also some of the other shows that showcase autism, and one of the ones we didn't mention was Everything's Going to Be Okay, and that actually does have autistic actors in it, and the character of Drea is just wonderful. But it is important that there's a saying in the autism community: if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Everyone is very, very different. And we need to make sure that the whole spectrum is recognised, and we don't fall into a trap somewhere that they're being stereotyped into the physicist, physicist or the savant, because we do have people with autism, with very severe autism, with non-verbal autism, with very, very significant challenges.
Hollie, I suspect most viewers won't know your story or your son's story, but what can an experience or viewing something like this, seeing it on a public stage, do for a young person living on the spectrum?
I think, well, my son's at 12, so he's probably still not quite grasping it. But we've always talked about autism and him being autistic the same way, as someone has blue eyes or they're funny or, whatever it might be. It's just part of who he is. It's never been something that we as a family have ever felt that we didn't need or want to talk about and acknowledge. And I think that's not the same for all families. So I think normalising it, if that's, no doubt the wrong word, but showing that people with autism have so much to offer, that they are full of love and affection, and they are funny and wonderful and some of our favourite human beings in the world. I mean, they are just never cease to amaze you and bring so much joy to your life. And the more people that get to see that, the more people that get to experience that, and the more people that get to see their minds opened up. Because if you don't have any personal experience, you might not really know what autism is all about. And so this can really help break down any stigmas, give families the confidence to go out if they do have a child with autism, and for autistic individuals to own that autism and be proud of it.
And I think too, what Hollie's referring to is the fact that, there is no one autism. There's autisms. It's a very broad spectrum. I think Love on the Spectrum did a good, admirable first go at showing lots of different people at different levels on the spectrum, because, if you watch some of the Hollywood shows, The Good Doctor, some of them are quite silly, but this was different. It showed the spectrum, it showed lots of different people at different stages, and it showed autistic people speaking for themselves, having their own relationships, talking about their own desires. The parents and the families and the supporters in the background played this bit part of just people who loved them and were cheering them on. It wasn't about us as families, it was about them as individuals, and Australia got to see that, and I think that was the success of it, absolutely.
Forgiveness and second chances are fine, but Barnaby Joyce's position is one of great power, privilege and pay. Do you think our country is actually committed to supporting females and progress when Barnaby Joyce is allowed back into office given his alleged past behaviour?
Nicole.
OK. Barnaby 2.0, will it be better than Barnaby 1.0? I don't know if you bet the house on that one, but I'm actually not going to comment on Barnaby. What I'm going to say, and again, exceptions to Andrew and Hollie because they're such nice people, but is this the best we can do in who we're sending to Canberra? I don't know, that's what worries me when you look at the crop of, was this our choice? Did we have to go back to Barnaby? You look at and sort of say, are our options so low? What have happened to our best and brightest going to Canberra, our smartest Australians, the ones that wanted to lead not as a job description but as like a verb, actually leading? Where are those people and why aren't they being attracted to politics? And that's what I think has to come out of this, is not why Barnaby but why so few choices.
Hollie Hughes, this was a question about Barnaby Joyce and whether it shows our country is genuinely committed to supporting females. Do you think he deserved a second chance as Deputy Prime Minister?
Hamish, thank you for the question, and I appreciate the questioner asking it. I am not going to comment on the National Party and their leadership choice.
It's not just the National Party, it's the government of which you're a member. He's now the Deputy Prime Minister. Your reaction to that?
Well, he's the leader of the National Party, and the National Party room made that decision. Now, I'm not going to make any commentary on the decision they made because, quite frankly, I wouldn't want them to make any commentary on the decision the Liberal Party made. So we respect that across all parties. Andrew would understand that as well. It's a matter for each party room. If the National Party feel that Barnaby is the best person for them to lead the National Party, that's their decision. And,
it's quite telling, isn't it, that that's all you can say about the new Deputy Prime Minister?
Hamish, I know Barnaby well. I can say lots more about Barnaby. He certainly injects lots of energy into everything he does. He's a fantastic retail politician. He was elected to New England with increased majorities consistently. I mean, he wins so hands down on primary vote. And I understand what Nicole's saying about, is this the choice? Well, the people of New England have made that choice consistently and with a very strong voice. The National Party have made their choice when it comes to leader, and that's a matter for them.
Andrew Leigh?
And Hamish, I think Hollie is dead right on this. She wasn't in that party room that chose Barnaby Joyce. She's in the unfortunate position of having to deal with these 1950s views on childcare, and I understand she spoke out vocally on that. But the fact is that this man is a one-man wrecking ball. It's not just that he wanted to execute Pistol and Boo and confused his trillions and billions. It's not just that he wants nuclear power stations in every town and thinks that climate change is a hoax. The fact is that he was removed from the job over sexual harassment allegations, and in a Me Too era, he's just not an appropriate person to be the Deputy Prime Minister of the country. We need people with judgment at a time of crisis. His last challenge was in the bushfires. This challenge is in a pandemic. We need people who think about the nation, not just thinking about themselves.
Jayden, I know you have done Toastmasters yourself. You're a fan of respectful discourse in public life. What do you make of our politics and the way it's conducted?
Jayden for Canberra.
No, absolutely not. No. So I suppose it is not something that I have ever sustained much interest in, and that is because I do not always feel that my demeanour towards civility and respect between different groups and idea groups specifically, that my demeanour for that is always represented by the people who are our representatives. And Barnaby Joyce, he knows how to earn a lot of attention, and he must be a very charming man. But I am curious about the question of whether the ability or inability for one to lead in their own personal life is reflective of their ability or inability to lead in their professional life. Does that cause them to be a vessel of the morality that we require in the administration of a nation?
And what do you think on that question, Jayden?
I certainly would like... I'm yet a little undecided on my answer to that, but certainly I have hitherto maintained not too much interest in Barnaby Joyce, and I think going forth I will continue to maintain no interest in him.
Yeah, bravo! Bravo.
I think that
very good question.
wins Answer of the Year on Q&A so far. Bill Bowtell, are you interested in Barnaby Joyce?
Well, I'm more interested really in what Barnaby Joyce represents in relation to climate change. Since 2007, we've had 5 Prime Ministers, 5 governments. Each one of them, more or less, has been brought down because of an inability to come to terms with the facts and evidence of climate change. Each Prime Minister has gone in, 14 years. Barnaby Joyce coming back in represents a return to strong climate denialism, a rejection of the facts and evidence about climate change, and creates a diabolical problem for the internal unity of the present federal government. And you have to say that if this is unresolved and no serious proposition can be taken to the meeting that's coming up in Glasgow about reduction of emissions, much less anything else we have to do, then we might well be in train of seeing the 6th Prime Minister fall in less than 15 years on climate change. We cannot go on like this. It's bad for the economy. It's certainly bad for the health of Australians and the planet, and it is time to change. And Barnaby Joyce coming back in is just a symptom of a real inability to come to terms with the facts and evidence.
Leave it there on that note. That's all we've got time for tonight. Would you please thank our wonderful panel, Nicole Rogerson, Bill Bowtell, Jayden Evans, Andrew Leigh and Hollie Hughes. And Jayden, go easy on the DMs in your social media, mate. It sounds dangerous. Next week, we're live in Queensland at the Brisbane Powerhouse. The Premier, Anastasia Palaszczuk, will be on the panel. Border restrictions mean that I may or may not be there, so please join whoever is hosting the show next week. Have a very good night. back.